I know. There we are. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, you made it in. I was nervous. It looked like it was struggling to connect, so I'm glad you're
It
here.
was definitely struggling to connect. I don't know why, but now we're here.
It must be a Zoom overload. It's all good. We're in it. Great. Well, welcome, welcome. I think it's time to get started. So I'll keep an eye on the waiting room and let more people join, but I'll hand the mic over to Jennifer, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad you're here. Good to see your smiling faces. Flora, especially you smiling. So welcome today. And On One Foot is a virtual learning series, as many of you already know, that features a different Jewish faculty member from our local universities every other week to spotlight the incredible Jewish intellectual talent that we have here in Memphis for the entire Memphis Jewish community to join. Each guest speaker is encouraged to discuss their academic area of expertise to teach us about navigating life's challenges today, as well as share their own Jewish journey. Our speaker today is Dr. Mark Kaplowitz. He received his PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University with a dissertation on the interpretation of Spinoza found in the writings of Jewish German philosopher Hermann Cohen. His research focuses on the Jewish philosophical tradition, and he is taught at the University of Memphis, Rhodes College, and Christian Brothers University. His current position is adjunct professor of religion and philosophy at CBU. And we're anxious to hear what he's going to teach us today. Thank you so much for being here, Doctor.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen right now, and let's see if it comes up. Share. There we go. Do we have it? Are we sharing?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the title that I gave my talk today is Rethinking Jewish Thought. And my field is Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy, however we're going to characterize it. But it's part of a broader, it's part of a broader tradition of what we would call Jewish thought. So let's turn this on correctly. There we go. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is Jewish thought? So what are we talking about when I say that we're talking about rethinking Jewish thought? What is Jewish thought? And on the one hand, it's possible to argue that anything that any Jew ever thinks would count as Jewish thought. That's probably too broad of a definition for what we're going after. In part, in order for something to count as Jewish thought in the realm that I'm operating in, it's got to be thinking about Judaism, about the nature, about the character of Judaism itself. And most of the work I do comes from philosophical traditions, but I also have done work in mystical traditions. So it's not just philosophical thinking about Judaism, but also Kabbalistic thinking about Judaism certainly would fit within this rubric. But there are a couple of other features that are necessary for something to fall within the boundaries of Jewish thought. One is that it has to be part of the conversation of Jewish thought that's been ongoing since Mount Sinai, I suppose. Jewish thought is thinking about Judaism that engages with predecessors within the Jewish tradition, and that is setting it itself up to talk to future generations of Judaism, of the Jewish people. The second part of Jewish thought, why is it rethinking Jewish thought? It's that in any particular generation, at any particular moment in time, Jewish thought is engaging with the world that Jews live in, and that means we're responding to a changing world. So the conditions under which we live changes, the broader world in which we live changes, the science, the technology, the knowledge that we use to explain the frameworks, the structures that we use to understand what Judaism is something that changes over time as well. So it's a conversation, but it's not a static, fixed conversation. It's a constantly evolving, ongoing conversation, using the terms, using the concepts that we've received from those who've come before in order to explain Judaism for ourselves, in order to set a framework for what Judaism and the Jewish people means going forward into the future. One of the things that becomes interesting for us, though, is when we have to deal with borderline cases. Whether something falls within the framework of Jewish thought is an open and interesting question for us. What you see here is a picture of Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza. He would have been known to friends and family as Bento Spinoza. And he was born in Amsterdam in 1632. He lived his entire life in the Netherlands. There's no reason to believe he ever left the Netherlands. He is descended from a family of conversos, of anusim. So his parents migrated to the Netherlands from Portugal, where his family had been living as secret Jews for about 100 years. And his family is part of a large wave of families that moved from Portugal to the Netherlands in the early 1600s in order to escape the Inquisition and in order to rejoin a Jewish community. So Spinoza grew up in a Jewish family. He attended Jewish day schools. He attended Jewish day schools up until the age of 17. When he was 17 years old, he dropped out of the Jewish school system, most likely in response to his father's declining health. So his father was falling ill and he needed to drop out of school in order to take over the family business. He wasn't particularly good as a businessman. He's much more successful as a philosopher. As you can see, he didn't live a particularly long life. He was born in 1632. He died in 1677. So he lived approximately 45 years. And the two major works of his, we have a few other writings of his, but the two most significant ones, one of them, the Theological Political Treatise, was published in 1670. The other one is called The Ethics Demonstrated in the Geometrical Method, which was published in 1677 after his death. Presumably the book had been sitting in a desk drawer of his for several years before it was published. And we know this because there are copies, handwritten copies, that various friends of his had that predate, that are several years earlier than that. But before we can get into what Spinoza talks about in those works, there's a really big elephant in the room that has to be addressed. And that's found over here in this text over here. I don't know how many of you can read that text there that's on your screen. I'm guessing you can't.
It's
a very lovely hand, but what you can see up here is that it's from the year 5416. It mentions here the 6th de Ab, so the 6th day of the month of Ab, and contra against Baruch Spinoza. I can make out those couple of words up here at the top. I'll tell you the rest of this is in Portuguese. So I don't know Portuguese. I suppose many of you don't. Even if I could decipher this handwriting, it wouldn't mean very much to me. But here's what it says. Here's what we have. On the 6th month of Av in the year 5416, that's July 27th, 1656, the 24-year-old Spinoza was excommunicated by the Congregation of Portuguese Jews. And again, this is the proclamation in Portuguese in the Book of Ordinances of the Congregation. Now, excommunication wasn't that unusual of an event in that congregation. The various rabbis who were involved in this process had excommunicated one another multiple times. And excommunication was the principal means that the congregation had for enforcing congregational dues, congregational taxes. So if someone was in arrears on their dues, was in arrears on their taxes, they would be excommunicated until they paid their dues, until they paid their back dues, and then the excommunication was revoked. This excommunication of Spinoza, however, is different than those other excommunications. And particularly it's different in the language that's used in the excommunication itself. So it's a much harsher, much nastier excommunication than those that are given to anyone else in the history of this community, of this Portuguese Jewish community. So so I'll point out, first of all, that it's the Lords of the Mamad, so it's the lay board of the congregation that issues the excommunication. Again, that's standard practice, but it's done in the presence of the rabbis of the community. So the rabbis are participating in the process, but it is a lay-led process of excommunication. And all we know about what Spinoza's doing at the age of 24 is it says here that they're daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds. Honestly, we don't know what abominable heresies he was practicing and teaching when he was 24. We don't know what monstrous deeds he may have been committing. There's all kinds of speculation because, again, it says something about a community that they're willing to expel someone for their thoughts, for their beliefs, for their deeds. As it happens, some of the things that he was saying, some of the things he says later on are not that distant from things that other rabbis in that community had been saying and were getting themselves excommunicated over, but they eventually would appeal those excommunications outside of Amsterdam and were kind of told to tamp it down and not excommunicate one another. Those ideas were acceptable. But Spinoza's version of whatever he's thinking at the age of 24 is beyond the realm of what they accept. The curses are serious curses, and the excommunication ends with a warning: no one should communicate with him either in writing, nor accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor within 4 cubits in his vicinity. That's social distancing, I suppose, not coming within 4 cubits of someone. Nor shall he read any treatise composed or written by him. So the excommunication bans the reading of anything Spinoza writes as well. And at the age of 24, he hadn't written anything yet, at least nothing that we know of. So it's a curious situation. But also curious is Spinoza's response. So Spinoza wasn't there on the day when the excommunication was announced in the synagogue. They had a ceremony. I don't know how, there's some very Gothic versions of the ceremony, but it may just be that they read it from the bema in front of the ark in an empty synagogue, who knows. But when informed of the excommunication by a messenger, the community sent a messenger to inform him that he had been formally excommunicated. His answer was, "Very well, this doesn't force me to do anything I would not have done of my own accord had I not been afraid of a scandal." So he was willing to be kicked out of the Jewish community. He would have been willing to leave the Jewish community, but it's not a step he would have initiated because it was scandalous. But once he's kicked out, he doesn't seek to return. He's not seeking to repent. He's not seeking forgiveness. He's not asking to be let back in. He's fine. You don't want me, I'll get on with my life. And it does cost him things. So later on, there's a some legal cases that he has against his sister. His sister argues in front of a rabbinic court, or in front of a court, that Spinoza should not inherit anything from his father's will. And the claim is that because he's been excommunicated from the Jewish community, he's not entitled to any of the property that was left behind from his father's estate. And Spinoza happens to lose this case. His sister, who lives in Curacao, she lives halfway across the world, is filing these paperwork, and she wins these suits. She gets possession of the bed. She can sell the bed and keep the cash. Spinoza doesn't get his parents' bed. I think that was all that was left in that estate at that point anyway. So again, we have this figure who says, well, if you kick me out, that's fine, I'll move on. What's most surprising, though, about what happens to Spinoza is that he doesn't join another religious community after he leaves after he's kicked out of the Jewish community. So typically, again, his family had lived as crypto Jews. His family had lived as Catholics in Spain for 100 years.
In our lifetime.
And he's not drawn into the Catholic Church. He's living in the Netherlands, which is a Calvinist country. He doesn't join the Calvinist Church. There are a whole range of non-conventional, non-conforming Christian communities in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. He's friends with people who are members of different religious communities. He doesn't join other religious communities. In a sense, in a very real sense, he's often described as the first modern Jew, certainly as the first secular Jew. That it's possible for someone to get by in the world and not be affiliated with the Jewish community in a religious way, and not be affiliated religiously with any community. He's the first secular European in all of European history. He has no membership in any religious community. So when that happens, does that make him, is he still Jewish or is he not Jewish at that point?
Yeah, he's Jewish.
So from our perspective, it's very easy to say that he's Jewish, right? His mother is Jewish. He's born into a Jewish family. He's ethnically Jewish, we would say, or he's a secular Jew. We could use those terms. In his day, that language didn't exist. That terminology wasn't there yet. We don't have very many reports from Jews reporting on their interactions with Spinoza. What we do know is that the outside world, the non-Jewish world, still continued to regard him as a Jew. The outside world regarded him as an apostate Jew. So among the things that exist, there are records from the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition had a file on Spinoza, so they still regarded him as a Jew. And other people in the Netherlands talking about him regard him as an apostate Jew. But it's a curious case. So going back now to the things he wrote several years later on, it's still a question whether what he has to say belongs within the framework of Jewish thought. Is the thinking that he does Jewish thinking? Certainly with these publications here are written 15 years and more after he had been expelled from the Jewish community. So if we describe what he writes about in these two works, it'll help answer the question. The Ethics is his most significant philosophical work. It's the most among his writings, it's the one that's most read by philosophers. And in it, he argues for a pantheistic conception of God. His claim that he makes is that God is identical to nature. God is identical to nature. There's no transcendent God that sits outside of the natural world. There's just the natural world that surrounds us. The laws of nature are God's laws. How do we know that God wants us to observe the law of gravity? Well, you can't violate the laws of gravity. That makes it a law that God really makes. If it's from God, you can't break it. And the other thing is that he describes is that the world is entirely deterministic. So the world is a physical world, and physical things lead to physical things. There's, if you know the state of the world and where everything is and how it's moving in a given moment, if you have a God's eye view, you can project out how the universe will play out to infinity. So he refers to that as extension, as the universe an extension. You can also view the universe from the perspective of thought, but our thoughts have to parallel extension. So when we feel emotions, when we think we're making choices, we're not making free choices. Our emotions are simply biochemical processes that are going on in our bodies that are affected by the physical world that we interact with beforehand. All of our thoughts and emotions can be predicted in this way by means of he doesn't have concepts of biochemistry, but by the mechanical movement of things within our bodies and brains. And you can project out exactly how we're going to act, how we're going to respond to things. There's no free will in Spinoza's world either. We're all just little chunks of God that are part of this giant God that's nature. So that's what he talks about in the Ethics. He doesn't talk very much. There are a couple of mentions in passing about Jewish beliefs, but it's not a major theme. The other book of his is the Theological Political Treatise. In the Theological Political Treatise, his goal is to defend freedom of thought and freedom of expression. His argument is, the overarching argument in the title of the book is that a government is safest and most secure when it grants its citizens freedom of thought and freedom of expression, which seems like a pretty straightforward claim to make. What's interesting is the way he gets there. It's a radical claim to make in his day, but the way he gets there is even more extraordinary. He gets there by making the claim that Moses did not write the Torah, that the Torah is an amalgamation of different materials that were assembled probably by Ezra the scribe from earlier sources that he had that were written by human beings, that Moses was seeking to establish a political constitution for a government, but it was a disastrously failed constitution that Moses wrote, precisely because it didn't grant freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And that the Jews living today are still attempting to live under this broken Mosaic constitution. And from that set of thoughts, he gets to arguments for freedom of expression. He still thinks religion is necessary. People need religion in their lives. Government should grant freedom of religion as long as the religions aren't looking to break the government. But that he's certainly taking the Torah off of its pedestal for the Jewish people, but he's writing in Latin. He's not writing for a Jewish audience. He's writing for the broader Dutch audience. And in the Netherlands at that time, the Calvinists see themselves as the new Israel. They see themselves as reestablishing a state based on the principles found in the Torah, as they understand it. So saying that the Torah should not be the center of our political world is making a comment on Dutch politics as much as it's making a comment on the Jewish world. But at the same time, he's interested in saving his neck. The work is published anonymously. It's published with a false title page. So it said that it's published in a different city by a publisher that doesn't exist, because he's worried about persecution on account of what he's writing. He had a friend who was sent to jail and who died a year before he wrote this book for his friend's political thinking as well. So so in the course of it, he says a lot of very nice things about Jesus and about Christianity. And you can arguably, he's saying those things because attacking Christianity and attacking Jesus would definitely lead to a mob finding him and killing him. But attacking the Torah is safer.
Finding him and killing him.
Yeah, finding him and killing him. He didn't want that. So we have Spinoza with these two works, and the problem is the question for us, a question that's still debated, is whether Spinoza belongs to Jewish thought. Is this Jewish thought? He's thinking about the Torah. He's talking about rabbinic literature. He's talking about Maimonides. He's talking about other Gersonides as well. He's talking about medieval Jewish philosophers in the course of his argument. But he's doing it from a position outside of the Jewish community. His Hebrew is excellent. He also has a book on Hebrew grammar. He knows his Torah really, really well. He hadn't reached the stage, he was 17 when he left the day school. He hadn't reached the stage where they where they extensively engaged in Talmud in the Dutch educational system. So this is the question. And one set of answers to this question that I've looked at, I'll say that Cohen is almost unique in his opposition to Spinoza. Cohen virulently attacks Spinoza in some of his works. I'll say a few things about Cohen. Cohen is a German philosopher. He's born in 1842. He dies during World War I in 1918. He's an old man. He dies of pneumonia in his own bed. He's not fighting the war. Cohen grew up in a small town in what's now East Germany, in what was East Germany, what's now the eastern half of Germany. His father was a cantor in the local synagogue, and Cohen himself began rabbinical school in the conservative, in what's closest to what we would call conservative seminary in Breslau, Germany, now part of Poland. But he dropped out of rabbinical school in order to pursue a secular education as a philosopher. He became a professor of philosophy in Marburg, Germany. At the time that he became a professor, he was the only Jewish professor of philosophy in Germany. At that time, there would have been Jewish professors in other fields, in medicine, in science, but philosophy kind of is like a very precious thing to the German world. And letting a Jew in to the world of philosophy as a professor and as a Jew who did not convert was unique and virtually impossible. He kind of got that professorship because a mentor of his had passed away during a 3 or 4 year window when there was a liberal in charge of appointing professors. But if it wasn't that it happened in that really tiny window, it would never have happened that he could have been appointed to that professorship. In his day, he became the leading philosopher in Germany. He was the foremost professor of philosophy in Germany. Nonetheless, he didn't get promoted up to the highest ranking position, which would have been at the University of Berlin. After he retires, he then moves to Berlin and is teaching in a rabbinical seminary in Berlin for the last 4 years of his life. So here we have someone who's actively engaged in the life of the Jewish community and who is very upset to what he finds in Spinoza. There are a couple of reasons. Kind of the most characteristic aspect of Cohen's response is his opposition to the popularity of Spinoza in late 19th, early 20th century Germany. So if you think about it, as Jews, we often take pride in what Jews accomplish. There were two articles in the Watchman last week about Jewish scientists who are involved in discovering COVID vaccines. And then I started seeing the same things popping up in emails and going viral, right? That Jews take pride in what Jews accomplish. And here in Spinoza, you have someone who is Jewish, who's born Jewish, and who's at the forefront of the world of philosophy, whose philosophy is being read and being quoted and being discussed by non-Jewish philosophers, and who's prominent in 19th century German philosophy itself. So Jews take on Spinoza as a hero. You know, there are Jewish families that will have busts of Spinoza sitting on their bookcases, that'll have copies of Spinoza's books. You know, they'll have Mozart on top of the piano and Spinoza on top of the bookcase, because they see him as a source of pride for the Jewish community. Jews can participate in the secular world at the highest levels, effectively and prominently. And Cohen rather, is bothered by this. If we look at, again, I like working with text. I'm a text person. Unfortunately, that means I have a giant field of text on a slide that is probably too small for any normal person to read. But I can just read in the first sentence of it, you can get the feel of Cohen's attitude. Spinoza is the first philosopher who, having no positive personal stake in his inherited religion, felt moved to judge and condemn it. Moreover, he doesn't reject Judaism because he rejects religion altogether. He says nice things about Christianity. Going to the next paragraph here, thus concludes the demolition of his inherited religion, the religion of his origins, and the religion from which he received his first religious knowledge and instruction and his first ethical impulses. Spinoza's repudiation of Judaism ran counter to all enlightenment and tolerance and demolished the religious value of Judaism itself, but it was preceded long before his excommunication by alienation. Running to the end of this, no one who holds the views that constitute Spinoza's intellectual framework will acquire a love or understanding of Judaism. Do you feel the emotion there in the way that Cohen is talking about Spinoza? Do you feel that anger in his voice? The article this is taken from, an article about Spinoza, is often referred to as the article of hatred. It's just dripping with this contempt for Spinoza, with this anger and upset about the figure of Spinoza. It's regarded by many as kind of unbecoming, as kind of embarrassing for a prominent philosopher to be speaking in such emotional language about someone else's ideas. Cohen took it very personally that Spinoza not only was kicked out of the Jewish community, but made no attempts to return. And that in the course of making whatever argument Spinoza wants to make, that Spinoza attacks the Torah, attacks Moses. Now, what's curious about this, the one part of the reason why it's such an embarrassment, is regarded as an embarrassment, this article, is that the world that Cohen lives in would not have been possible without the work that Spinoza had done. Cohen doesn't object to reading the Tanakh historically, to using historical tools to read the Hebrew Bible, to studying the history of the text. And Spinoza is the person who introduced that method into Western thought. Cohen likes having the freedom to be able to think philosophically, to use whatever philosophical tools he needs to think about philosophy and to think about Judaism. Without the possibility of secular Judaism, There wouldn't be the possibility for liberal forms of Judaism, and Cohen is a liberal Jew. That the world that Cohen lives in is not possible without the contributions of Spinoza, and Cohen hates what Spinoza did. This is about as far as most people will get in their assessments, up until recently, that most people would get in their assessments of what Cohen thinks about Spinoza. But I find it interesting, I find the other side of Cohen's argument to be interesting as well. This is from a different book. This is from Cohen's Religion of Reason. This is his most important Jewish book. It was published posthumously, but in it, he's once again, well, on this slide, I'm not going to read it in the interest of time, but here he's talking about suffering. He's talking about disease and suffering. He's talking about poverty and suffering. He's talking about social suffering. And the claim that he's going to make is that Judaism's approach to suffering, Judaism's approach to illness, is the most significant contribution that Judaism has to make, that the prophets have to make to the intellectual and social world that we live in. That for the prophets, what it says here on the screen, for the prophets, death is not the biggest metaphysical problem. Death and afterlife is not the biggest metaphysical problem. Again, Cohen is looking at other philosophical schools that early forms of existentialism, for example, that view death as this big problem for human beings. The prophets, according to Cohen, are not concerned about death. They're concerned about illness, because illness represents suffering. But illness is kind of a small form of suffering. The bigger form of suffering is poverty. Illness is related to poverty. Illness is linked to poverty. Those who are poor suffer from illness the most. They get ill the most, and have the fewest means to deal with their illnesses. And on top of that, that poverty is a problem because it represents a sickness within society itself. Judaism's approach to poverty is that the presence of poverty within our community is an indictment of our own moral status. We fail as a community when poverty exists in our midst. And that's what bothers the prophets. That's and that becomes a religious problem. It's a problem directed at God. How can our society tolerate this? How can God give us a society or God gives us rules that tells us our society should not tolerate poverty? And so from there we go. He pops back into a discussion of Spinoza. But here he's not looking at what Spinoza says about Judaism. Here he's looking at what Spinoza says in the Ethics about the issue of pity. Spinoza doesn't think highly of pity. Pity is according to Spinoza, an evil emotion. Because when we feel pity, it means that we're being acted upon by the world outside of ourselves. According to Spinoza, pity and envy are kind of mirror images of one another. They're the same thing, just kind of directed at different objects. I look at the world, if I see someone who has more than I do, I feel envy. If I look at the world and I feel sad about the world, then I'm pitying someone who has less than me. But it's all just me comparing myself to others and looking at the outside world. And according to Cohen, this is a profound moral failing on Spinoza's part. Being unable to feel pity for those who are sick, being unable to feel pity for those who are poor, means that one's unable to motivate to address those problems, to address these problems within our societies. And therefore, Cohen is opposed to Spinoza's worldview. in my interpretation of Cohen, this is very telling, because for Cohen, Spinoza represents a much broader worldview. Spinoza is not just speaking for himself, or when Cohen is talking about Spinoza, he's not just speaking about Spinoza in this respect, but he's speaking about an entire worldview that says that there needs to be rich people and poor people. An entire worldview that says that as someone with power, anything I can do is justified, is what I need to do. My job is to make money, and who cares about the consequences of what happens? My job is to, to tear down forests. My job is to mine mines. My job is to manipulate the world, and I have no choice in the matter. If I don't exploit the world's resources, someone else will. So I have to get there first. And again, for Spinoza, it's all necessary, right? I don't make choices. I don't have free will. It's just what we have to do. That Spinoza's philosophy is the animating force behind the capitalistic world, behind capitalism and materialism in general. And for Cohen, that's something that's very anti-Jewish. There's something that's not Jewish about Spinoza's way of looking at the world. So we have this opposition between these two thinkers. Cohen clearly is a Jewish thinker, but looking at this grand history, what does that tell us about Jewish thought for now? And there are a couple of problems. And why is this rethinking Jewish thought and not just rehashing Jewish thought? So we have a few problems here. We have this problem that kind of Cohen's anger at Spinoza is this embarrassment among thinkers. We have this problem that Spinoza seems to be outside of the Jewish realm, that he's excommunicated, doesn't seek to come back in. There are plenty of people who would say that Jewish thought can happen in response to Spinoza. Cohen thinking about Spinoza's Jewish thought, but Spinoza is kind of this outside force, outside of the realm of Jewish thought. On the other hand, I didn't mention this, David Ben-Gurion at one point petitioned the rabbinic court to cancel the excommunication of Spinoza. The rabbis in Israel turned down the request. They said they didn't have the authority. You would need a court in Amsterdam with more prominent rabbis than the rabbis that originally sanctioned his excommunication, and those rabbis were more prominent than anyone alive today. So no, you can't de-excommunicate Spinoza according to the Israeli rabbis. But how does this, but looking at Cohen and Spinoza, we also want to ask how has our world changed since the early 20th century? How has our world changed since the late 17th century? What new problems do we want to think about now? And so I find this connection of Spinoza and Cohen to be incredibly interesting, but also incredibly fruitful. What I like from Cohen, what I take from Cohen is this strong social message that Judaism, when thinking about metaphysics, when thinking about God and the nature of God, doesn't do that in a way that's divorced from a set of values. God is not a mathematical problem for us to solve, but it has to link to a set of values that we're honoring and defending and fighting for. Now, the context in which Cohen is thinking about the nature of God, Cohen knows his physics very well. We know that he was reading essays by Einstein Einstein was a young scientist at the time, but Cohen is reading about relativity, early writings about relativity, because he needs to understand that new physics in order to be able to do metaphysics. In order to understand what God is like, you need to understand what the physical world is like. That's also what Spinoza was up to, understanding how the physical world works to understand how God works. But our understanding of the physical world is not the same is not the world of Isaac Newton, but we live in not just the world of Einstein, but the world of quantum mechanics. If we're not staying up to date on how our science understands the structure of the world, we can't understand how God works. On top of that, though, what I really like also from both Cohen and Spinoza is that they're systematic thinkers. They're starting with basic principles and developing a full structure of thought, a full pattern of thought that's not just simply talking about religion as something isolated, but our talk about Judaism and religion is connected to the full range of philosophical notions. So Cohen's system of philosophy, he's got a volume on logic, he's got a volume on ethics, a volume on aesthetics, and then afterwards he writes his book on religion. You can't deal with religion until you've dealt with everything else that's part of that full philosophical system of thinking. And I really like the clarity of Spinoza's writing. What I find clear, other people find it boggling, but I find Spinoza a clear writer. That the clarity of thought that he has is also something that's inspiring, and that he can't think about these broader issues without also engaging in it coming from a Jewish perspective, even if he's opposed to aspects of the Jewish world he lived in. So for me, there's a lot to learn from the history of Jewish thought that will make it possible for us to continue thinking about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to understand the Jewish world, to understand Judaism in the world and the world itself, and the bigger questions about God going forward. I think I've run my clock to its end, so I'll stop here, and let's open up for discussion at this point. Thank you all for your patience and listening.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions? I know I've been taking notes. I have a ton. I'm happy to start us off. I'm curious, when you were speaking about pity and the way that both of these thinkers think about or thought about pity, the word empathy kept coming up for me. And I wonder if empathy might have been a place where they could have met in the middle a little bit more. I'm curious if that's come up in your kind of findings.
Well, for Cohen, empathy is really central. When he's talking about, I mean, he's attacking Spinoza for not recognizing pity, but I don't think Cohen uses the word empathy or uses an exact cognitive empathy, but that is what he's talking about. That's where Cohen is going. That for Cohen, I can't even develop my own identity as a person until I've discovered someone else's suffering, recognized their humanity, recognized that someone else who's suffering is real, and someone else's suffering needs to be addressed. It's that finding the other comes first. Once I've found the other and am helping the other, am serving the needs of the other, helping them with food and shelter and comfort, only then is it possible for me to discover who I am, to recognize myself as a human being. I need to recognize other people as human beings before I can even know that I'm a human being. And that is empathy, right? That's right there. So for Cohen, that's central. For Spinoza, empathy is not that important. He really does emphasize, in order for me to be a free person, in order for me to be truly free, the kind of freedom I can have is intellectual freedom. And to have the fullest amount of intellectual freedom, I need to be generating my own thoughts and ideas on my own. I need to not be influenced by the outside world. I need to react. I need to respond to the outside world. I have to help others because it's advantageous to the world. If there are poor, hungry people, there are going to be poor, hungry people rioting, and they're going to bash down the walls to my house and steal things, and then I'm not going to have the freedom to sit and think. So I need to help others, but purely out of my own self-interest. We need to have a well-ordered society. Most people by their nature are kind of chaotic and violent. So we need a good government. We need structures of religion. We need to make sure that nobody's running around hungry, because that leads to chaos. But really, intellectually, emotionally, I need to maintain my independence so that I can be a thinker. And that once I'm thinking the biggest ideas about God and about nature and about the universe, then I achieve this kind of freedom that takes me out of the physical realm almost entirely. My mind is hooked into the biggest ideas, and I'm not worried about what happens to my physical body anymore. I've crossed beyond it. So those are two very different attitudes.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else have questions? I can keep going with mine. My second.
Hal had his hand up.
Oh, good. Hal, sorry, I didn't see you on
No,
the second half of the
just
page.
a very basic question, Professor, and I had to hop off for a second, so I apologize if I missed this. But are there any theories as to why Spinoza was excommunicated?
There are a number of theories. So if he was saying that Moses didn't write the Torah, that the Torah was written, 1,000 years later, that could be grounds enough for excommunication. One of the terms of the contract under which the Jewish community was reestablished in Amsterdam, right? When the Jews returned to it, it's a really curious story. When the Netherlands was part of Spain, Portugal was part of Spain in the early 1600s. In the late 1500s, early 1600s. So it's possible for Jews, for hidden Jews, for conversos, for anusim, right, for crypto Jews, to move from parts of Spain to parts of Netherlands. It's all part of the same country. But the Netherlands is a Protestant country, it's Calvinist, and Spain is Catholic. So there are laws in the Netherlands against being Catholic. So you have these crypto Jews who move to the Netherlands, and they're gathering on Friday nights in basements of warehouses and davening Friday night prayers, singing Friday night prayers. Their Dutch neighbors hear them and report them to the police and say that the Catholics are conducting a mass in secret in the basement. The police come to arrest these Catholics who are doing the mass, and they say, "What, Catholics? We're not Catholics. That's not a mass. We're Jews. We're doing Kabbalat Shabbat." And the Calvinists say, not Catholics? I guess it's not against the law. So the Jews then enter into agreements with the Dutch authorities how to live openly as Jews, and they don't have to be secret hidden Jews anymore. One of the terms of that agreement are that the Jews must maintain all members of the Jewish community must maintain that the Torah is holy scripture that was given by God to Moses. So if Spinoza was running around denying the authenticity of the biblical text, that may have been going against a contract that the Jewish community had signed some 50, 60 years earlier. So that's one possibility. Other people say that nobody remembered that old contract was written. That couldn't possibly be the reason. Other people say that he denied resurrection of the dead, and he denied the possibility of souls surviving after people die. So when you're dead, you're dead. And that would touch a nerve for this community he was living in, because everybody in his community had relatives who had lived their entire lives as Catholics in Spain or Portugal and were buried as Catholics in Spain and Portugal. And if they don't have souls that survive, then there's nothing to pray for. There's nothing to repent for, so that your grandparents can find their way to heaven, because they weren't living a Torah true life while they were living as secret Jews. So that would touch a nerve. there are other arguments as well. Other things he could have said. He could have said that the laws of the Sabbath aren't binding, and that could have gotten him excommunicated. Other members of the Jewish community would get in trouble for breaking Shabbat. So that could be something else that he was saying. We just don't know, and there are plenty of arguments in a whole bunch of directions. Does that help?
Mhm.
Great.
I have one more question that was chatted to me. It's, do you think the Jewish pull to consider Spinoza Jewish is because Jews want to claim his secularism or modernity as a Jewish concept? Is it a form of Jewish self-affirmation?
Yeah, it's absolutely a form of Jewish self-affirmation. It's present both in secular European Jews. So the folks that Cohen saw in his contemporaries in the early 1900s, secular Jews want to show that Jews can succeed in this culture if they are emancipated. When Jews are given civil rights, Jews will contribute to Western civilization, right? There's this ongoing debate throughout 19th into the 20th century, 18th, 19th, and 20th century Europe. The claim that's made is Jews should not have civil rights because Jews can't contribute to Western civilization. And then the Jews argue, well, if we had civil rights, we would contribute to Western civilization. So Spinoza is an example of someone who had civil rights and contributes to Western civilization. And, again, the Jewish communities had long been making the claim that because we don't have civil rights, that's why we don't have great musicians. That's why we don't have great artists. That's why we don't have great philosophers. That's why we don't have great novelists. And just give us civil rights and we'll show you what we can do. We'll be great scientists. And if anything, that case has been proven, right? When Jews have civil rights, Jews have contributed to culture and civilization in every realm. The other side of it, though, also comes from a Zionist side. One of the things that Spinoza mentions in the Theological Political Treatise, when he talks about how broken the constitution that Moses created is, he does say that the one thing that Moses did right was that he created institutions that maintained Jewish continuity. So circumcision is something that prevents Jews from integrating into broader society. Jews who are circumcised will stick to themselves because in a world where no one else is circumcised. They'll be weird, they'll be outcasts. You eat strange food, you'll be weird, you'll be outcast, but it keeps this Jewish community concentrated together. And then he shrugs his shoulders, and who knows, as long as the Jews stay together as a group, maybe someday they will reclaim their territory and reestablish a government and become a normal nation state like everybody else in the world. Who knows? Maybe it'll happen someday if they if they stick together, remain circumcised, and speak their own funny language. So Zionists look at that it's kind of an offhand comment that he makes, but Zionists look at that and see a lot of inspiration. So, right, if we stay together as a nationality and we speak our own language, then we're entitled to a nation state and we can do it. It's possible. It's not, God didn't make any rules that say Jews can't have their own state. That's just, that's just a weird interpretation of our own religion. So yeah, it comes from both of those directions.
Awesome. Thank you. Any last, maybe short burning questions before we wrap up for the afternoon? I know that Dr. Kaplowitz is very easy to reach, and a lot of us know him in real life off Zoom, so I'm sure we can keep the conversations going. I feel like I need to do some learning myself and continue thinking about these things because it's such an interesting topic, clearly interesting thinkers, and it's been such a pleasure to have you here sharing these ideas with us today.
It's been a great pleasure talking to all of you. I really appreciate having all of you here and having this venue in which to speak to all of you.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again to everyone who is attending these. This is our last lecture of the semester, and we will have another batch of lecturers speaking to us in the spring semester, which starts at the end of January. So stay tuned for more information about the next lineup. Thank you, Dr. Kaplowitz, for wrapping us up strong and sharing your wisdom with us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you here.
And thank you, Sophie, for organizing the whole series. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who's been participating that, it is a pleasure talking to the members of the community about the work that animates us. And also for posting these on YouTube as well, so that, they're available.
Yes, yeah, that's a good note. I have been recording all this lecture and all the other lectures, and they will be available in our archive. So I'll be sure to circulate all of those links, including this one, as soon as it's uploaded. Wonderful. Thanks, guys. Shabbat Shalom. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you in January. Bye-bye.
Bye.